The Creative Nonfiction Podcast is sponsored by Goucher College's Master of Fine Arts in Nonfiction. The Goucher MFA is a 2-year, low-residency program. Online classes let you learn from anywhere, while on-campus residencies allow you to hone your craft with accomplished mentors who have Pulitzer Prizes and best-selling books to their names. The program boasts a nationwide network of students, faculty, and alumni, which has published 140 books and counting. You'll get opportunities to meet literary agents and learn the ins and outs of the publishing journey. Visit goucher.edu/nonfiction to start your journey now. Take your writing to the next level and go from hopeful to published in Goucher's MFA program for nonfiction. So here we are again. Happy to say last week's episode was featured in Creative Nonfiction Magazine's November newsletter as a distraction, meant only as flattery, of course. Jane Friedman of episode 102 fame, also gave us a great shout-out in a blog post a few weeks ago, along with Brad Listy's Other People and Joanna Penn's Creative Pen podcast. That is riff-worthy. Oh, you didn't think I was going to drop that hammer, did you, sucker? Hey, this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I speak to the best artists about the craft of telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Mara, hey? And this is what we do. Today, I welcome Natalie Singer, author of California Calling, a self-interrogation, to the show. We talk about confidence or the lack thereof, books as mentors, and day jobs, and feeling shame for day jobs. I hope to change that perception over the next 6 million episodes, but shame is real, man. Shame is real. Well, are you subscribed to this show? You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and just about anywhere else you get your pods. If you like this episode, tell one friend. Hand the show off like a baton and let them run with it. I'd love to see the show grow. It's getting there. We march on, man. We march on. It's also November now, and the Creative Nonfiction Magazine is doing a NaMiWriMo, is that how you pronounce it? For memoir instead of novels. That's cool. Yeah. It's a good chance. Maybe I can use this month to get through a titanic round of edits on my 20th draft or so on Tools of Ignorance, the old baseball memoir I've been working on for years. It's at least 20 drafts. It's probably more. I'm not ashamed of that. You should know. All drafts are rough. Some of us take a long time to get there. If you take a lot of drafts to finish anything, you're not alone. Got a newsletter. Just came out this month. You should consider subscribing to it. I give out reading recommendations, but I'm also thinking of sprinkling in some other cool stuff I've stumbled upon over the past month in the vein of Austin Kleon's amazing newsletter. I love his newsletter. I'm going to steal like an artist. See what I did there? Hey, today's podcast is brought to you by Creative Nonfiction Magazine. For nearly 25 years, Creative Nonfiction has been fuel for nonfiction writers and storytellers, publishing a lively blend of exceptional long and short-form nonfiction narratives and interviews, as well as columns that examine the craft, style, trends, and ethics of writing true stories. In short, creative nonfiction is true stories well told. Well, I think that's it. Okay. This is my conversation with Natalie Singer. Not writing or doing anything in that realm. What do you like to do to unplug, or what kind of exercise or personal wellness things do you employ so it actually lets you come to the work with a fresher mindset?
What's exercise, Brendan? What is that word you just used? I should totally fake it right now. I should be like, well, I try to get in like an hour run every day.
Mm-hmm.
No, I am pretty good about unplugging. Not always with exercise. I do yoga, which is nice, and that's kind of more of a mind relaxer. So one of the things that I juggle with, along with just having a very busy life, is making, space for my mind to quiet down. And I need to do that, obviously, just to stay sane, but also because, I find like that's when ideas come to me, and that's when I can my brain can sort out questions around writing that I've been frenzying over. And when I'm using like my conscious brain, I have a lot of ideas and I kind of get into a frenzy, and sometimes I can't solve them or figure out where to go. And so by doing a kind of activity like yoga, or just completely unplugging and doing something fun with my family, kind of the sort of opposite happens, I guess, when I take my mind away from those concerns. Ideas and new routes kind of form, almost subconsciously.
Yeah.
And then when I come back to the writing, I have those. So sometimes it's hard for me to remind myself to do that, because I think, I'm trying to solve this writing problem. I'm trying to come up with a form for this essay or this project, and I can't. And I'm circling around it and mulling it over. And I sort of have to force myself to walk away, because I know logically, my logical brain knows that that's when I'll get answers. So I try to do that regularly. And just unplug and go do something fun. I read a lot. And this year also I started, in 2014, I finished, or I went back rather to school as a kind of an older student to get my MFA. And when I finished in 2016, I kind of stepped away from the whole, writing community, writing classes, workshop space. And this summer, a couple of years after that, I went back to that, and I took a couple of workshops, which seems counterintuitive, but that, for me, that's kind of relaxing and engaging in a different way, because I'm not sitting alone with my work. I'm kind of in community.
Yeah.
And so by doing that, I was like reminded that this is really useful for me. And also, we're never really done necessarily with that kind of thing. Maybe we have our degree, maybe we have a book published, maybe we have several books published, but there's something that you can get from that kind of community space that I think we always need. So I have been reminded of that, and I'm taking advantage of that.
When you're in those unplugged settings, how are you, and when the idea strikes, how are you recording these ideas so you don't lose them?
Yeah, you're going right to one of my problems.
Oh, good. It's good. 5 minutes in. I
try to have a notebook with me at all times, but that is hard because, a lot of times something will come in my head and I'll think to myself, there's no way you'll forget this. Like, this is so good. This is so important. Of course you're going to remember this. Like, don't even worry about it. And of course, that night or the next day, it's like completely gone.
Yeah.
So I always have a notebook with me, but even that is hard sometimes to get to a notebook. But what I've started doing recently that I'm pretty excited about is that, writers are always looking for like, what programs are you using to write your book, and how do you keep your notes, and what do you do with revisions and things like that. And my husband, who's kind of a nerd and also works for Microsoft, started nagging me a year or two ago to try to use OneNote for my writing work. And I was like, what are you talking about? Who does that? But I recently tried it. I started trying it, and I really like it because it's got, this system where you can have pages and tabs. But the thing that I like best about it is it's very accessible from my phone. And obviously we all have our phones with us constantly. And I always have my phone in my hand, even when I'm unplugging, I'm taking pictures of my kids or what I'm doing, or checking in. And so it's very easy to open up that page that's synced to all of my work and add an idea in right there. So I've kind of recently bypassed the whole paper notebook thing. and just try to log anything that comes to my mind right in the system where I'm putting my creative work. But sometimes I also just believe that I'll remember and I don't do anything and then I don't remember.
And it's called OneNote?
OneNote.
OneNote, okay. Some people use Evernote too, which is kind of similar in a sense. Like you're able to save things and it does sync across various platforms. But that OneNote, that sounds interesting. I love talking about like gadget tools and programs that, anything that kind of helps trick yourself into getting the work done, whatever that is. And it's always nice to get someone a fresh take on that. So that's really cool that you shared that. And you said you were reading a lot these days too, and the mark of any competent writer is being a voracious reader. And so, what are you reading these days?
That's a great question. Let's see. Recently, I've read a couple of books I love. There by Tommy Orange, the novel, which everyone was talking about this summer, was a fantastic read, along with Heartberries. And I just read this book. I actually have it right here. I don't know if you've heard of this, The Cost of Living, by Deborah Levy. And I just got done with that. And that is a fantastic memoir. The subtitle is A Working Autobiography, which I love. I think right now, even though I recently read a couple of novels, I mostly read nonfiction, creative nonfiction. And I'm really interested in, if you're not surprised, books that are and authors who are kind of upsetting or disrupting the memoir, creative nonfiction genre, and doing things with form or approach that are different. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the reasons I like this the Cost of Living book, because, it could be described, I guess, in one way as a divorce memoir. But it's more of an idea book, kind of more in the vein of a Rebecca Solnit type of investigation and exploration. And this idea of calling something a working autobiography, meaning, in one way that the text is being used to work out questions or problems more in the way that an essay would, rather than, a memoir or a novel with a traditional narrative arc, is really exciting to me. So I'm trying to spend time with, right now, books that are, disrupting form and expectations. So that's what I'm looking for at the moment. And I also just read a book. I can't tell you the name of it right now because it's not out and the name's not set, but a wonderful kind of fragmented memoir of postpartum psychosis by a writer I know, and I'm working on a blurb for this book, and it's going to be out in 2019, and it's fantastic.
Cool. Yeah, I might have to have her on then when that book comes out.
Connect you.
Very nice. Yeah, I'd love to. Now, I love the idea of books as mentors, and those books that kind of change your world from black and white into color, the ones that unlocked what it was possible for you to do with the written word and so forth. So what if you can name any, maybe peeking over at your shelf, are there 3 to 5 books that you often reference, reread, things that showed you what could be done?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I don't know actually where I would be without books like that, because more than anything, those books are just what you said. And I still, honestly, I still have dark moments where I think, like, I can't do this, or I don't know how to do this. And I will go back to those books year after year. So yes, those books. One of those books is The Chronology of Water by Lydia Yuknavitch.
Yeah, that book's amazing.
Right, which really, really, really just opened up for me the possibility of how to tell personal story, and the power of both text and silence, and the permission to tell a story in a way that reveals things and keeps other things hidden intentionally, not because as an author you're afraid of it, but intentionally for aesthetic and for story. And so that book gave me the permission to approach story in that way, and I go back to it constantly. The writer Abigail Thomas is a huge influence on me, and she has a few books. She has many books, but the book that one of the few that I go back to very often is called Safekeeping. And essentially it's a memoir of a relationship that's been lost. The person has died. But the book is deceptively simple. It's told in a series of vignettes. So each chapter is, maybe as short as a paragraph, maybe as long as a few pages. And these vignettes are layered on top of each other. It's not chronological. We move around in time. We move around in perspective and point of view. She utilizes characters in brilliant ways. And I go back to that book constantly to remind myself what the possibility is of writing in a very contained and distilled way. And then two other authors that I often reference. I mentioned Rebecca Solnit, who it's hard to use Rebecca Solnit as a reference because every time I look at her work, I'm like, okay, she's so brilliant that what can I possibly draw from this? But I do. And, several of her collections of essays, one, The Far Away Nearby, I look at all the time as a way of, right now I'm really obsessed with whether it's possible for the form of a creative nonfiction book-length work to both exist as sort of self-contained components, or what you might think of as essays, while also simultaneously carrying forward the arc of an on-the-ground story chronologically. And it's something I've been puzzling over as I'm working on my next project. And that book, The Far Away Nearby, is sort of one of the closest examples I've been able to find of kind of what I'm thinking of. And so I've been looking at it a lot just in terms of form and how she's weaving many threads together. And she's talking about both the literal stories and events in her life and the sort of broader kind of conceptual ideas. And then there's another author who's more well-known, I think, as a poet, but I adore her essays, and her name is Leah Purpura, and she has a few collections of essays, and I think she's coming out with a new one in 2019, and she's one of those sort of quiet writers in that, maybe people don't necessarily know about her, and she kind of has a quiet, sort of not out there public presence, and she comes out with these beautiful books every handful of years. But her essays are just beautiful lyric, sort of prose poetry. And I'm very drawn to the kind of language in that, and see a little bit of that reflected sometimes in some of my writing, and go back to her to remind myself that you don't need to be writing about a huge thing. You don't need to be kind of laying out stick by stick a massive argument in order to tackle something big through language, the language itself. And she's just a master at that, and I love her work. So there's a handful of very influential writers.
Yeah, I like the idea that you can go back to those writers or specific books, and they kind of realign yourself in a way, like let you know the possibilities and kind of let you inspire you in a way, like, all right, they were able to pull it off, and it's, you draw that kind of inspiration and energy to apply it to your own work in some capacity. You can try to get as close to that star as you can, but at least they're showing you the way. They're taking your hand in a sense.
Absolutely. It also makes you feel like, or it makes me feel, I should say, like, there are writers out there that I'm in conversation with. And obviously writing can be lonely, and you're working on something that you don't know if it will ever be read by other people out there, and you don't know how it will turn out. And this idea that when I sort of feel like I falter a little bit in my confidence or question what I'm trying to do, I think of these other writers, as touchstones and who are out there, and that my writing is trying to be in conversation with their writing, and it helps kind of realign me. Don't think about anything beyond that. Think about this is a conversation going on that you're engaged with, and your writing is going to be part of that conversation.
Well, it's funny you bring up confidence, because that's something I've been thinking a lot about lately. The nature of this podcast is I talk to dozens upon dozens of people that I greatly admire and respect their work, and oftentimes it's very humbling to read the work, and then to even try to come back to my own, and in a lot of ways it's kind of crippling in a sense, because I they're so good, and then I'm like, what can I contribute to this? At least maybe I can have a conversation about it, and it does bruise the confidence a bit. It's just the nature, my nature. I'm a little insecure by nature.
Yep.
I think a lot of writers are. Yeah. And you too, you brought up confidence, and I wonder how how do you remain confident in the face of people whose work you admire that you feel like you could never aspire to, but also writing for not knowing if your stuff is going to be read too. Then that's an element of it as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in the beginning, when you don't know if your stuff is going to be read, you pursue your work both out of, I kind of feel like for myself anyway, if I sort of think back to the younger Natalie, or the essence of who I am, that kind of confidence question is tied very much to a desire to kind of belong. I want to belong. I want to be kind of part of this group. And so when I was beginning and I didn't know if my writing would ever be published, that kind of fueled me. Like both that, like I want to belong, I want to try this. I want to get from here to there. And also just the desire, when you're a writer or an artist of any type, most of us are really driven to do that art for ourselves. Like we can't not. We have to write. It's how we make sense of our world. It's how we think about it. We have to. So those two things, kind of the inner need to write and also the desire to belong to this group, this world, kind of drove me at first. And then I think once people do read your writing and they respond to it in the way that you had hoped, then you can use that. And then that's in your toolkit also. Then you think, that's a confidence booster, because you realize, people love this book, or people love this essay, or they, I just shared 2 paragraphs at an open mic and now someone's crying. Once that happens, then you realize, okay, like my words can have an impact. Maybe I'll never be a cultural commentator or a North Star the way that Rebecca Solnit is, but I can contribute to that and impact people. And so once you see that happen, even on a small scale, you can use that. But before you have that, I think being driven by your desire to make art, and also letting that kind of insecurity, whatever version it is for you, but letting that drive you and saying, okay, like I am insecure, I am unsure, but there's a reason I want to do this. I want to belong. I want to be part of this conversation. Just accept that and kind of let it push you. And that is what I did, and it worked.
You said you, like most writers, have to write. Filmmakers, they have to make film and so forth. Where did that come from, that hunger and desire to write, even in the absence of audience? It's something that you have to do.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that it started, when I was a kid, and I was an interesting child. I'm like one of those people, they say, like, I'm an extroverted introvert.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm introverted, and I was as a child, in the sense that, being in a large group and sort of having to assert myself, um, made me very nervous. And so, what if everyone ignored me? And what if no one knew I was here? And what if I'm actually literally invisible and I just don't know it? And, all of those worries. And so I spent a good amount of time alone as a kid, reading and writing. And I also had a very confusing childhood where um, a lot of things were sort of, if you've read the book, and people have read the book,
Mm-hmm.
they'll see some of this. A lot of things were kind of shrouded in mystery. And I also was very obsessed with mystery and with the unknown. Some of my favorite shows were like The Twilight Zone and Ray Bradbury Theater. And I would wake up at 5 a.m. when it was still dark out, when other kids would, be getting ready to watch the Smurfs and other 80s cartoons. And I would like watch this dark, dark stuff that I could do because my parents were still asleep, and no one would say, "What are you watching?" And so I really liked, this kind of unknown world. And the way that I could kind of wade through the unknown was to question it. And I did that through writing, and I would kind of invent scenarios to explain things that I didn't understand. And then, later, when I was a teenager, very angsty, I would use writing to kind of work through some of my feelings. And so I've always felt like I need to turn to writing to kind of to ask questions and to process things. And then I didn't really pursue writing as art until much later. My background was journalism, and when I was in college, I was kind of floating around and I didn't know what to do. And I had to place myself in that conversation about, well, what are your talents? Like, what could you do? Because you can't live in a box. On the street, you have to, find a career. And I thought, okay, well, I can write, so might as well just go into journalism. Not really thinking that through very much. And so then I spent a lot of years kind of working on those writing skills, but in the sense of learning how to tell other people's stories. So I was writing and I was kind of satisfying that need, but in a different way. And then I think when about 10 years ago, I realized that there was kind of a part of that wasn't fulfilled, and that was like the desire to make art. And so that's when I got serious about saying, all of this angsty stuff and all of this processing your reality and these questions, that's all served you well, but actually you can turn this into something beautiful that other people want to read and that can help them too. And so kind of moved in that direction.
What did being a reporter teach you about the type of writing that you ultimately want to do, which is more, more artistic versus, the inverted pyramid style writing?
Yeah. I feel like in a way it taught me everything. First of all, it taught me, I think, the importance of people's stories. Like, everybody has an important story, and that stories happen in very small moments. It's, some people have crazy things happen to them, and they write books about those crazy things, and those are fascinating. But most of my favorite books and essays are not about crazy things at all. They're about very, very ordinary lives, ordinary occurrences, realities that can happen to any one of us. And I think being a reporter and learning how to listen to people and listen to their stories and look for that, what Barth calls the punctum in the photograph, that moment of sort of crystalline emotion, that center or heart of something, which doesn't have to be a huge, huge event, but can be the tiniest moment learning how to find that, I think, was something that I learned to do, being a reporter and listening to people and giving them the space and the kind of compassion and empathy that you have to have as a reporter, because it's terrifying to speak to a reporter, somebody you don't know, about something that happened to you or that you observed, or your feelings, or something that impacts you. And it's like utter chutzpah to ask somebody to do that.
Yeah.
So you have to be so empathetic and so gentle. I mean, some reporters aren't, but I felt like that was the only way that I could do that job, was to just give them the space and the kind of respect to say whatever it was that they needed to say. And so learning to build that muscle, then I was able to have that muscle on to turn it to myself, and give myself this sort of space and empathy that would kind of counteract that voice, like, well, nothing huge happened to you. It's not like you were in an airplane on 9/11. Like, come on, like what, why do you get to have the space to tell people a story? And I could kind of counteract that voice with that very well exercised muscle of empathy, which was, everybody has a story, and there's something that's very universal in here, and let's just calm down and get to it. So I think that's kind of the most important thing that I brought out of journalism. And then also just language and words, and sort of being excited about exploring how to distill something to its most essential language, as a way of communicating. And that's kind of the type of writing that I'm doing right now. Is I've been calling it like getting to the quick of it. Mm-hmm. And that's why I've been playing a lot with sort of fragmented writing, and instead of relying on these whole, architectures and structures, the way, an absolutely incredible, beautiful essay by somebody like Rebecca Solnit does. Right now, I'm more interested in these sort of glimmers, or these quicks, getting to the quicks of stories and emotion. And I think that's kind of an outcome of being a journalist and working with 12 inches. Mm-hmm. You have 12 inches to tell this person's life-changing story.
Yeah, you've cultivated a skill of not only what to put into a story, but ultimately what needs to be taken out of it, right?
Right.
And what about writing short and fragmented is appealing to your taste at the moment? And it's certainly an element that you use with aplomb in California Calling.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what's appealing to me is it's kind of combining the things that I love about. Here's my dog.
Oh, nice. This is a dog-friendly podcast.
I'm going to let her in.
Cool. What kind of dog?
Come on. She's a Labradoodle.
Oh.
Come on.
Very
nice. Get in.
What's her name?
Her name is Mabel.
Mabel, all right.
She's a sweetie. All right, lie down. So I think it combines like two things that I love. One is sort of this advantage of more of a traditional essay, which is built on inquiry, and you can have a question that you don't have an answer to, or a series of questions, and layer them and explore. The purpose of this body of writing, of this text, is to explore a question. And, hopefully you get to a place at the end that's different from the place that you started in. Doesn't necessarily mean you've solved it. In fact, I hate the essays that sort of artificially tie something up with a bow, but you get to a place of new understanding. So I love that about the essay form. And then what I love about sort of the more traditional narrative arc is that you have this forward-moving story that, you're hooked from the beginning, and it's sort of that essential human-like desire to find out, well, what happened next? Then what happened? Then what happened? And so I'm trying to, I think, take elements of both of those things and combine them into something that a kind of text that's allowed to ask questions and explore unknowns as a way of working things out, and also moves forward, but kind of, I guess, slices away the parts of both of those forms that are maybe unnecessary. Um, and it's an experiment, right? Because, I find like some of the writing that is in California Calling and some of the types of writing that I'm working on now, I'm asking a lot of the reader. I'm asking the reader to do a different type of work than you're asking the reader to do when you're writing a novel or a memoir that's a traditional narrative arc that's driven forward mainly by story. What happens next, chapter by chapter. And you're asking the reader to do a different kind of work than you are when you're writing a traditional essay where you're laying out a lot of questions, but the narrator is constantly coming in and expounding on those. You always feel the guiding hand of the narrator in a traditional essay. The narrator's right alongside of you, sort of unspooling this inquiry. And you know that a version of the narrator that has finished writing this essay, knows where it's going. And you feel that. And you feel that kind of thread unspooling and that hand holding taking you along. And, this kind of hybrid, I'm asking something different of readers. I'm asking for trust, but I'm also saying, there are gaps here. There are gaps that you are going to need to fill in. And that these silences that are being left here intentionally are meant for the reader to pick up and utilize to help fill in the story. And it's a different kind of request. It's a different kind of work. And honestly, I'm exploring this type of writing in part because it's what I'm very excited about as a reader right now. And so I'm enjoying reading that type of work, work that's in that kind of hybrid ecosystem. And so I'm employing it as a writer and kind of asking my readers to go along with me on that.
And when you were writing this book and all your writing in general, how do you approach your days when you're in that generative phase of the process? What kind of routines and rituals do you employ so you can confidently approach the work for that given day?
Writers have all different types of processes. I've never been the writer who will be able to tell you, I wake up and from 5 to 7 in the morning, I always write, and then I have my tea break, and then from 10 to noon, I revise. I don't have a schedule like that, both because, my life doesn't really allow that kind of a set schedule, and also because my brain doesn't really work that way. So I do tend to generally write in spurts of an hour or two at a time. But they vary wildly over time. If I'm engaged closely in a project, in the developmental stage of a project, which I am right now, then, that what that could look like is maybe I'll wake up in the morning before I, start the other parts of my day, and I'll make some notes, or I'll revise something that I did the day before. And then later in the day, I'll come back and spend an hour or two trying to generate new work. And then I might leave it for a few days. And, what I'm doing when I'm not writing is thinking. And I'm finding that the kind of writing that I'm trying to do is predicated on thinking that happens away from the page. And so I'm learning to give myself space and not get kind of frustrated or frantic if I haven't written, 3,000 or 4,000 words this week. Maybe I've written 1,000 words this week or 500 words this week, but the time away, I've been able to advance some of these ideas by being away from the page, or by just letting them simmer a little bit. So the process is kind of unpredictable. And some days I might, write for hours, and then I might go a week and not write anything, but it feels like I'm still doing work during that time.
Do you have a way of recording or measuring these spaces of thinking so you can actually reflect back on it and feel like you did in fact accomplish something, and not look back on the day and be like, shit, what did I do?
No, I like to actually flagellate myself and say, you're useless. You've done nothing this week.
Yeah.
You're not a writer. That's part of it. Staying in that mentality.
We've got a lot in common.
Yeah. No, I do. I'm a habitual note taker, so I take a lot of notes. And for a year or so, I was joking. Basically, the year where California Calling was, essentially done, but going through the sort of editing march toward publishing process. That year, I was sort of joking when people would say, like, what are you working on next? I was saying things like, I don't think I'll ever write another book, but I'm going to write a lot of notes in my life because all I could do was take these notes. So, but it turns out that those notes are writing. Those notes are the work. And so I find as long as I'm like, if I'm having thoughts and ideas, as long as I somehow log them, and that could be very detailed, or that could be like one sentence, like, can't stop thinking about image of cookie in bakery. I know what that means. Like, I know this scene or this memory that I've been turning over and over in my mind for weeks. I know that will remind me or hint at that, and then my mind will allow the rest of it to flood back. So just taking notes kind of solidifies those ideas somewhere, and then I can come back to them when I'm in more of a production mode, and I can make use of them. So it's a process that I think I finally feel comfortable with and confident that time isn't being wasted, as long as I find a way of sort of recording some of those thoughts or ideas for use later.
Yeah, I like this idea of you like collecting string in a sense, like picking something from here, and here. And then when you have those moments where you can expand on a thought or just a cool idea or the smell of these fresh cookies or something, it's something that you have readily accessible because you've been collecting and curating things throughout your day and your week.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, it's like essentially it's a toolkit to choose from. And I recently, worked on an essay that, I guess essentially the topic of this essay could be described as female rage in the face of kind of living in a world that seems to many women and girls to be very threatening toward them or violent toward them.
Right.
And this sort of essay pairs together this sort of scene where my family went on vacation to the seaside in Oregon, and we rode these kind of rickety go-karts that we ride every year. And there was, I have 2 teen daughters, and there was another family there with some teenage sons. And so part of the essay tells the story of what happened on the track with sort of the energy and tension and dynamics of the men and women and teenage girls and teenage boys in this space. And then there are other parts of the essay that, literally are these kind of glimmers that I'd been curating and collecting over the previous couple of months. I rode a ferry, and a man was walking with his wife, and he crushed a soda can in his hand like it was a piece of tissue, and the noise made me jump. And I wrote it down that day. Like, what does that mean? What does that mean to just be out and about in your daily life, and the being reminded of the physical strength of men, makes you jump as a woman, makes you look around, and a few other kind of incidents, some things from the news. And so somehow it became clear to me after, kind of curating and jotting those totally disparate events and thoughts and ideas down over a few months, these all belong together. They're actually working together to talk about something that's difficult to talk about. So I'm finding, that can be the outcome of maybe not churning out a lot of work in the moment that something happens or the moment you have a thought or idea, but kind of letting that build and grow and making note of it. And I love the way you use the word curate, because I think that's very accurate.
When you're working on something, or even in the spaces in between where you're doing a lot of thinking about the process, I always love getting a sense of how each individual artist defines rigor and tenacity and hard work in this line of work, where sometimes it's not always tangible, that a lot of actual nose to the grindstone, bloodied up hands, blisters, all that kind of stuff, that it's apparent in something more physical. But with something that is of this nature, sometimes it's hard to define what hard work is like. And I wonder how you would define that. So when you do sit at the computer or with your notes, you can be like, oh yeah, like, that was a good day. I feel good about the time spent and the work spent today, as a, how you measure that. I always like getting a sense of that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Right, because in a sense, if you measure it by what you publish, you have to be so patient, such a long tail, that you can't only measure it that way, right? Because most of us would go insane. I think for me, the way that I recognize most that I've been working hard, and that something just came from that labor, is that I look for that moment when I can reread something that I've written, and I get kind of a little frisson, like a little chill.
Mm.
And it's just like, I'm sure every writer or artist has a version of that in their different way. Maybe it's not a chill, maybe it's who knows what it is, but this sort of feeling like this is good. And that'll usually happen, like maybe it's 2 or 3 paragraphs, maybe it's 1 paragraph, but it's that, for me, is like the indication that you have been working, and this, like, now you have this, and this is the fruit of that labor, however much labor went into that. And sometimes it's, weeks or months, and sometimes you sit down and something incredible comes in 30 minutes. Whatever that type of labor was, that this is the fruit of it. And I always have that kind of physical sensation. I guess it's excitement or belief in it, or feeling moved by what you just wrote, or feeling the sense that this is going to move somebody else. And so I look for those, and those kind of carry me along and help remind me that there's going to be a bigger payoff for this work down the road, but that I'm on the right track.
And when you're in the throes of a project too, whether it's book length or even just an essay, long or short, and you were talking earlier, like right back when we started, about dark moments, and oftentimes it's like ugly middles, messy middles, those times where you're too far away to turn home, but you're also, the lighthouse is way off in the distance. How do you deal with that grind in the middle to put your head down and to try and finish, and not get too weighed down by just being so sort of lost in the middle of the dark forest?
Yeah. I think I'll try anything I can, and it's different every time. Sometimes in those moments, that's when I stop, and I reach for those authors that we talked about earlier, and others like them. If I really, really hit a wall, and I really feel like I'm completely in the dark forest, I might start having thoughts like, this is insane. What you're trying to do isn't a thing. You're going nowhere. You're going in circles. You can't get from where you are now to the thing that you're envisioning. Like, there's literally no path of breadcrumbs to see. Sometimes I'll just stop, and I'll go and read the writers who I feel like have done that. And almost every time I'll read, and it doesn't have to be like a long break. I'll read something from one of these other writers, and I'll say, oh yeah, like, okay, I'm back on the track. Like, I can see the path. Like they did it. This is what I'm trying to do. I can do this. So a lot of times it's actually walking away. And sometimes, when you have a deadline or something, it's more just forcing, slogging. And a lot of writing teachers talk about just keep typing, just keep your fingers moving, just write crap until something beyond crap comes out. And I'm not very good at that at all. I don't. Usually if I force myself to do that, nothing good comes out.
Even coming from newspapers, you have a hard time doing that?
Yeah, I do. Like,
yeah.
I'm more of a planner and a plotter.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm more like I'll stop with the writing and I'll go back to the notes and the thinking and I'll diagram and I'll make lists of associations and I'll kind of go backward to the just the sort of blueprint stage of something and I'll get myself unstuck there and then I'll go back to the writing. And, it's different for everyone. I do wish that I sometimes I would be able to, just use keep the fingers moving and something eventually good will come out kind of approach. But I think it's the same sort of skill as writing fiction, which I'm not great at, which is the sort of sitting down to the blank page, having sometimes no idea what you're going to do. And sort of you hear fiction writers say, like, I'm going to let the characters tell me what happens next. That's like a terrifying sentence for me. I don't think I could ever operate that way. And I wish I could because I'd love to be able to write, good fiction, but it hasn't happened yet. I kind of need to get through the thinking first and I need to come to the page with ideas or direction. And so when I get stuck and I'm in the forest, I'll back out and I'll go back to the ideas and the direction and reading the writers who are kind of in that similar conversation and try to get myself unstuck there. And I will be pretty ruthless about it. It's not like I'm giving up and walking away. It's that I'm kind of going to these other doors and trying to get in through that way instead.
Would you characterize yourself as a very strong finisher of work? Like when you get to a point where you can see the end of something, even if you're 3/4 of the way through, like you're able to power through and
yeah, I'm definitely a finisher. I'm kind of like a almost like mercenary in that sense. Like for me, if I'm not a writer who has like a ton of unused writing just sitting there, like I have 5 novels in my drawer kind of thing. I'm really mercenary. Like if I'm working on it, I am going to use this in some way. I don't care how. I don't care how many times I have to revise it. I don't care if I have to set it aside for the next essay or the next project. But like if I'm working, if I have work, I'm going to try to use it. And I think that's a kind of a combination of, coming from the sort of journalist background, which is like, you don't have a choice. You need to finish. You need to finish in a certain amount of time. And there's not really the luxury of waste. You can't write 3 or 4 news stories that never get used. Like you have a certain amount of time, certain amount of energy. You have to make this work in some way. So I think part of it is that, and part of it is just, I have a really busy life, like we all do. And the last sort of 10 years when I've really been focusing on my creative writing, I've almost always had a full-time job. I'm, a mom to 2 kids. And I have to have this juggle. So I don't really have the luxury of, starting things for fun that I never come back to, or kind of just letting something go because it maybe isn't speaking to me right now. I have to finish things and I have to make them work.
You alluded to day job, of course, being a mom too. I think this is a good point and worth expanding on. This idea that most, I would say, 9 out of 10 people I've had on this show, and like you're probably going to be episode 124 of all these people do, whether they're essayists, memoirists, doc filmmakers, narrative journalists, you name it, and most, if not all of them, do have day jobs, and then they find ways to write long features or essays or even books. It's not their primary form of income. And I think a lot of people, and I'm myself included, feel like you sometimes just feel like a loser when you
Yep.
can't support yourself wholly on your art. But the fact is, so many, like you're agreeing, like a lot of people, you gotta subsidize your art with something more steady. So what are some jobs that you have, or maybe your current job? What do you do that eats up most of your time? So, but then you're able to, of course, find your writing time and make time for the art that matters to you.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's something that so many of us struggle with, right? And it's just a reality. And I used to think that it was, the worst thing in the world, the worst reality. And now I've kind of come around to realize, like, first of all, it's the most common reality for so many artists. And I also think, just kind of looking at my own trajectory, that it actually has helped me over time. So, some of the things I've done, I mean, the job that I have now is I work my day job in corporate communications.
Mm-hmm.
So, I work for a large technology company and through an agency as a vendor, and I help them shape their communications. And sometimes that's, can be creative, and sometimes it can be really the opposite of creative. And then I've also been a magazine editor. I've been a freelance writer, but more as a journalist. For a while, I owned my own small children-related business. So lots of different things. And in the beginning, I found, especially when I was working as a journalist, I found that, like, I was really kind of drained of creative energy at the end of the day, even though it was a different kind of writing.
Mm-hmm.
I just kind of felt drained. And then as I kind of moved into other types of day jobs, which weren't so creative, I felt like my creative writing became more and more like a necessary outlet. And then I sort of needed to do that, just kind of for my own, so sort of like a release valve. And so in a lot of ways, like that kind of second job of creative writing, um, while it was difficult to manage the time, it sort of fed me, and it allowed me to be creative in part of my life. And then the other parts of my life that weren't creative were sort of easier to manage, or I was able to approach them with a more creative state of mind because I was, had opened the door to my creativity. I wasn't kind of shutting it out or pushing it down. And so, what does that look like in reality, though? I mean, when I went back to get my MFA, I was, I think, 37. This was a few years ago. I was 37 when I went back to school.
Mm-hmm.
And, there were people in my program who were, 22 and who had just gotten out of their undergraduate program and were, pretty carefree, like living in a house with 6 people and paying $150 in rent and,
Mm-hmm.
Kind of just studying. And I was like, this is hilarious. Like, how am I going to create comparable work alongside these people, who maybe had less life experience, but the luxury of time that I couldn't even imagine. And when I started that program, I thought I would be taking a sabbatical from my day job. And a month into that time, my husband was laid off. And so it suddenly became impossible for me to quit my job. And really, it wasn't a possibility in my mind for me to step out of my MFA program that I had waited so long to kind of go back to, waited until, I could afford it, until I had kind of advanced on my career and sort of built some security in my life. And I was like, I'm not going to give this up now. I'll just have to do both. And what I learned in that 2 years, and that program was where I started the essentially the framework for California Calling, which was part of it was my thesis. What I learned in there that surprised me was that I was kind of coming into this space with so much energy, even though I was exhausted as hell, but so much creativity. And, I wasn't doing less work than my peers in my cohort who didn't have a job and who didn't have a family. I was producing as much as them because there was so much on the line for me.
Mm.
And I had so much at stake, and that sort of pushed me to work. And I think it's the same thing with parenting children, especially, I guess I can only speak for myself as a woman, and maybe some fathers have had this experience too, but when you have children, your identity kind of takes a beating. You're like, who am I? I spend so much of my time, caring for these people. And what happened to the parts of me from before? And it feels like there's a lot at stake too, especially with me. I have daughters, and, I never want them to grow up and think like, as an example, my own mother, before she had me, and this was in the 70s, she went to art school and she had a portfolio, and she was a wonderful artist. And then she kind of stepped into motherhood, and then that was what you did. You let everything else fall away in those days. And I remember as a kid, her big, huge black leather portfolio kind of sitting in the closet. And I would always ask her, can I look through it? Can I look through it? And sometimes she would let me. And there were these beautiful, oil paintings and acrylic paintings and all this beautiful work. And I would sometimes ask her, do you ever want to do this again? Do you want to go back to this? And she would say like, oh yeah, I don't really have the time. And I never wanted to show that possibility to my kids. I wanted to show them, like, if you have a passion, you stay with it. And so there's so much at stake, both when you have to, make a living and support yourself, no matter what, and when you have children. I think nowadays that for me, that kind of fueled my production. And I was never so productive as when I had all of these things to juggle. And my best friend she's in the book, her name is Suzanne, and she always jokes with me, like, you just need to pile on one more thing, don't you? And I do, and it makes me more productive. So for me, that's what works, and that's what kind of fuels me.
It's amazing how these kind of boundaries and structures can actually make you more productive if you have that. You know what? On Monday morning, there is only 45 minutes to get
Yeah.
anything done. And
Yep.
you will be, and this is anybody out there listening, if you only have 45 minutes and you're focused on that, you can probably get more done in that 45 minutes than you could in 90 minutes if you really focus.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like, I wrote parts of this book, literally, I'm not kidding you, in 20 minutes while in the car, while a kid was having a soccer practice.
That's
in
amazing.
20-minute stints. And I read this story a few years ago while I was working on this book, and I wish I knew who it was. Maybe I'll find him someday. But a story I heard from someone about this guy, local author in Seattle, who they knew, who basically he was kind of in a similar scenario, had a full-time job and he had young kids, and he would take his minivan, which I kind of I comically related to, because I had this like horrible minivan at the time that I just I hated. It was like this symbol of like everything that I didn't want to become, and I had to drive it. I don't have that anymore, but I had this minivan at the time, and I heard the story of this guy who was a dad. He had young kids. He had a full-time job. He had this shitty minivan, and he was writing a book. And the only way that he could get writing done was he'd take the minivan and he'd leave the house at 6 a.m. and he'd drive the minivan to the Fred Meyer, which is like, the Fred Meyer. It's like a grocery store, like / Target, Walmart type of place.
Yep.
And he'd park it in the parking lot, and he'd sit in the back of this minivan, which I don't know this guy. I don't even know who he is, but I always pictured like just a disaster, like old smelly sports clothes and like soccer balls and towels and, all kinds of the gross stuff that you would have in the back of the minivan. And he'd sit there and he'd write for an hour. And he wrote a book this way at 6 a.m. in this parking lot of, basically like a Walmart type place. And I always used to think of this guy and say like, well, if my friend said that this guy did it that way, like, then I'm not going to waste 20 minutes that I have sitting in my minivan while my kid is on the field. And I wrote so much of this book in those little spurts. And exactly what you said, nothing is wasted. If you have 45 minutes, you get to work, and you're mercenary, and you do not waste. You don't sit around for 45 minutes and think, I have writer's block. Like, writer's block is a luxury that I think sometimes can get in our way or can kind of harm us. If we don't have the time or the luxury for writer's block, then we just put that aside and we just get to work.
Yeah, similarly, I know I say this periodically when it's germane. It's when I had Andre Dubus III on like a while ago. You know, we talked about his memoir Townie, but we were also talking a lot about just his writing process. And when he was writing House of Sand and Fog, this novel that was
one of my favorite books ever.
Yeah,
Incredible book.
Brilliant. He wrote that book in 17-minute spurts in his truck. He would drive. He had a 17-minute window. He had 3 kids, a wife, supporting. He was a carpenter, and he would drive to the side of a road near this graveyard, and he would have 17 minutes to write longhand in his truck. And he wrote that book in those little spurts. Just sandwiched,
oh my God,
finding that little crack of time in the course of a day. Look what he made of it. It's life-changing book. And of course, he teaches today. He doesn't solely live off book sales. I mean, he's got his own kind of day job and so forth. But it just speaks to, that was the time he needed, or the only time he had, and he made a brilliant piece of art that was life-changing, and he did it in 17-minute increments. Like, you don't need 8 hours a day to do it. You just need a little bit of time and rigor and persistence.
That's an unbelievable story. I'm so glad you told me that. I'm going to go listen to that now, because that's literally one of my favorite books, and like just an unbelievable piece of beauty. Like, you look at a book like that and you're like, how?
Yeah. Yeah, it's episode 54. I'll send you I'll send you the link too, but it's episode 54 if I recall.
Yeah.
Oh man. Well, with what you've had the experience of writing California Calling. This self-interrogation of these snippets of, asking yourself these questions, open-ended questions, and you're able to, just have these little vignettes throughout the whole thing. And it reads like a nice little sort of interrogatory slideshow, if you will. And it's cool. It's fragmented in that sense that it's really sort of exciting to you at the moment. From the creation of this book and what you're working on next, what have you learned and how have you grown as a writer from this form and to what you might be working on next?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, what I'm working on next, I thought in the beginning was going to be more of a collection of sort of traditionally structured essays. And I'm working with right now some concerns around wildernesses and how we relate to wildernesses, both literal wildernesses and metaphorical wildernesses. And I've always been strangely terrified of the wilderness, the woods, nature, and in a weird way, that like biologically, according to my research, we're not supposed to be. We're supposed to feel this sort of sense of biophilia or affinity to nature. And I have never felt that. I've always felt kind of a terror. So this project began as an idea of looking into that. And as I thought about that idea more, and also as sort of some themes kind of emerged on our national landscape and our cultural landscape, I started to become obsessed with the multiple meanings of the idea of wilderness, the wilderness, let's say, of loneliness, and the wilderness of middle age, and the particular wilderness of launching your daughters into the world as it is today, as they're on the cusp of becoming women, and the wilderness of middle marriage and things like that. So I thought at first, as I began working on this, that I would, be able to use a form of standalone essay to kind of interrogate, again, if you will, this sort of different ideas about wilderness and how we can approach them, these wildernesses. And as I've been working on it, it's kind of morphing into more of kind of a structure that is harkens more back to what I used for California Calling, but is different in the sense that I think, you asked me what I've learned, and something that I've learned with this, freshman book is that form can be very exciting, and we want to try a lot of different things. And I think kind of being in an experimental mindset at the time that I wrote California Calling helped shape it. And I think this next book will take some of that, but maybe evolve it in the sense that I'm hoping that there's a story on the ground that will hang together more tightly and kind of advance with a narrative arc, and that story on the ground will be embedded within this larger constellation of kind of essayistic ideas. And like I mentioned before, it's been difficult to find some books that have this type of structure. So I don't know if, I'm crazy and kind of trying to invent something that doesn't exist, or whether it's not possible, or whether I'm pushing new ground. So I'm kind of in that space right now of trying to figure that out. And if it's pushing new ground, then that's great and it's okay, but I need to figure out how to do that. So that's sort of where I am right now. And I think, one thing I've learned is, it's fun to experiment, but I also need to keep in mind what readers need and what's going to be most effective for readers. And then also, learning that not everything has been done yet, and it's okay to figure out how to do something new. So I'm kind of in that space of experimenting again, and I don't know really where it's going to lead me, but hopefully somewhere good.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place for us to end this very first conversation of what I hope will be many between you and I in the coming years as more and more of your work comes out.
I hope so too.
Yeah. Where can people find you online and maybe get more familiar with your work if they don't already know?
Yeah. They can go to my website, which is nataliesingerwrites.com. And I post links to interviews and writing and events and appearances and things there. And if they want to, they can also figure out how to follow me on Twitter and Facebook through that website. All my and Instagram, all my links are there. So yeah, and I do sometimes teach classes in Seattle. I'll be teaching a class on the essay this winter, as well as a class on how to juggle. I think it's going to be called Feeding the Beast. How to basically juggle art and your real life.
Oh, that's perfect.
So what we talked about, and
yeah.
I think that'll be through Hugo House this winter. If some folks are in Seattle, so you can find out about all that good stuff at my website.
Oh, that's really cool. And you're just up the road from me. I live in Eugene, Oregon. So we're not too far away. So
well, I hope we get to talk again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for the time, for coming on the show and coming on a Sunday morning. So this was a lot of fun, and I look forward to, like I said, more conversations like this in the future. So thank you for your work, and thank you for your time. Well, that was fun. There's been maybe 5 podcasts in the run of the show that were not fun, but this was not one of them. This was a fun one. So, the show is at CNFpod on Twitter, and I'm at Brendan O'Mara on Twitter. I don't know. Follow either of those, or 2 would be pretty rad. The show is on Facebook, too, if you're into that. I'm also on Instagram, which is not so on brand. It feels like a real trip. I post drawings, audiograms, pictures of me as a dinosaur. It's a mess. So it's perfect, because my decidedly childless life is a mess. I got 99 problems, but a podcast ain't one. You doing the newsletter thing? Subscribe at my website, BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey. And if you like the show, share it with a friend. Just one friend. The pod needs to keep on growing. Otherwise, what are we doing? Otherwise, people won't want to come on the show. They'll be like, you're not worth my time. And I'll be like, man, that hurts, Mom. So please share it with a friend and subscribe if you haven't already. Oh yeah, and if you can't do interview, see ya.